Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my talk, Playing with Gender, a design framework for character customization. So before I dive in, I want to, there we go, give you a quick overview of what I'll be talking about and roughly how much time I'm going to spend on it. So I'm going to introduce myself, tell you a little bit more about my background. Then I'm going to introduce what I have dubbed the choice. And afterwards, we're talking about some alternative approaches to this. But then we will be spending the majority of the talk looking at a new design framework that I hope will be useful to you when you work on your own projects. And then I want to leave you with some useful resources at the end. And after that, I want to open the floor to a Q&A. OK. So a little bit about myself. I'm non-binary, and I'm a freelance narrative designer. Some of the games that I've worked on include the Anno series, 2205 and 1800, as well as Tom Clancy's The Division 2. And I'm currently working on Mars Vice and Morbid Metal. And I've been researching character creators since around 2017. For obvious reasons, I have a personal investment in this topic and in how gender inclusive they are, how many options they offer. But it is also a super interesting topic, and there has been so much development in the years since, and so many games coming out with really fresh new takes on it, really cool new ideas. So I've been spending that time paying attention to what's going on, analyzing what might be best practices, and I also had the chance to include some of that in an unannounced title so far. So I'm really excited today to share with you what I've condensed out of this. So to do that, let's talk about what the issue is, or as I call it, the choice. So at the beginning of a lot of games, you might be presented with something like this. Are you a boy or are you a girl? And then you get to choose one or the other. And depending on what you've chosen, you might be given an appearance. It automatically changes how NPCs talk to you or about you. If it's a game that has some type of customization, then maybe the customization options might look different depending on which one you chose. Maybe if you play as a boy, you have 4 haircuts that are kind of shortish, and if you're a girl, then you have 12 that are long. And there are also some games where it might actually change story choices or choices that are available to you, like, for example, romance in Dragon Age. So why is this a problem, broadly speaking? Because all of these things that I've just listed, none of them are player choices. They're all choices that have been taken away from players. They only chose at the beginning, male or female, and then all of these things were just automated for them. Obviously, this is limiting to non-binary players that might not see themselves in one of these 2 choices, or trans players that don't just want this one section. But to be honest, this limits all of your players if they're trans or cisgender. Because at the end of the day, everyone benefits from having more player freedom. And I'm sure you know some men who have long hair. So everyone is really interested in this. And specifically, as I mentioned, because there has been so much progress in the last few years, there's also now increased scrutiny and higher expectations from players and the press to really look at this and offer more choice. So what are some alternatives to this? I'll give you a really brief overview. Because what I've noticed when I bring up gender-inclusive design is that a lot of people tend to assume that, OK, in order to make it as inclusive as possible, it should look something like this. So a highly detailed character creator that offers every possible choice under the sun. And that's great, because you give all of this control to the player, and they can mix and match whatever they want, and they have this really large selection of physical traits and accessories. And these character creators are really cool. They're popular. They work really well for the games that they're in. But there's also some other ways of doing it. Another common one that you might have seen before is a pronoun selection. It's really simply asking players how they want to be addressed. So the first game that I've seen that did this was 2064, Read-Only Memories, where at the beginning of the game, players are asked for their name, and then also given a set of pronouns to choose from. So here you've got they, them, she, her, he, him, and then under the more options option, you have 2 more sets of neopronouns, as well as the opportunity for custom input. And some other games might go a completely different route by choosing to go with an ambiguous protagonist and removing all gender signifiers. And by doing that, giving this projection space for all players to project themselves into. So in this game, Alone with You, the player character is actually the character on the right, this person in an astronaut suit. And as you can see, you can't see much about them at all. So you really don't know what they look like. Therefore, you don't really get any clues about their gender, but also, for example, their ethnicity or their age. So it's really left very open and deliberately not elaborated. And you, of course, see this a lot also in first-person games or in top-down strategy games. So of these different ones, which is the right one? Which do I recommend? It's a bit of a trick question, because obviously there is no one perfect way. Some of these that I've shown are in direct opposition to each other, because there is really only the right way for the game that you're making. Because gender is really, really complex, so the solution that you will want for your game needs to be very tailored to both what your game is good at and what it has to offer, and also which section of gender it's actually looking at. So to delve further into this, when I say gender is very complex, it does beg the question of, what is gender anyway? So for the purposes of this talk, it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't matter what gender is, like philosophically speaking, or deep down, or whatever. Because it's going to be more useful to you to think about how we signify gender instead. So those things are hairstyles, clothing choices, pronouns, but also making a statement, like how I did at the beginning, saying that I'm non-binary. So if you break it down this way, and you really only look at how gender is expressed and perceived from the outside, or stated in some kind of way, you can use these as individual independent building blocks to build your own solution from them. And I think that's going to go a long way. So with this in mind, I want to introduce a new framework to you. And I'm going to be leading you through 5 questions to ask yourself while making your game. The first one is, what role does the player gender have in your game? What do I mean by this? For example, if you look at the Sims franchise, I would say that gender plays a major role in it. Because the Sims simulate our own world, gender and everything. And gender impacts everyday life in a lot of ways. And a lot of these ways that feature in Sims quite prominently are, for example, sex and dating, appearance, character dynamics, fashion, and more. And people are really interested in having these little virtual dolls play in their little virtual doll houses with the things that gender entails there. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where we might want an example where gender is irrelevant, we have Anno 2205. It doesn't feature in it at all, because there is no avatar in the world. You have this top-down view. It has no bearing on the gameplay at all, because the gameplay is about building houses and factories and managing production lines. And there's no reference to gender. Characters come and talk to you directly. So is gender even necessary to bring it in here? Does it add anything? Because in Anno, you are actually a corporation. You're not even the CEO of a corporation in this part of the franchise. You're just a faceless corporation building houses. So why would we start gendering that? But most games, I suspect, are going to fall somewhere in between the spectrum, where gender is going to be important in some ways, but irrelevant in others. So, for example, in Dragon Age Inquisition, the main way in which you might perceive it is through the avatar, because that enables players to role play. And one major key that people are super interested in is romance. So it has a gameplay relevance there. Because, for example, it is actually quite important that Dorian from Dragon Age Inquisition is a gay man, so he's a guy who's only interested in guys, and that is sort of important to his character quest. And then in other aspects, it's completely irrelevant, like combat. It doesn't matter what gender you chose at the beginning, your character performs the same in combat, because that's not a difference that this game is interested in exploring at all. Some games might do something really weird, and then it's especially interesting to ask yourself what role the player gender has here. Because what if the protagonist is a man by default? In Dream Daddy, you play as a single dad who is getting to know other single dads and maybe developing some romance. But the developers really thought about what types of men there are, because there are lots of them, and that includes trans men. So what they did is when you build your own, you don't build your own dad, you build yourself, but you build your dad's Sona. And you get to choose body types, and they wear undershirts, and some of them actually wear binders, so the lower row. And a binder is just a compression garment that flattens your chest, so a lot of trans masculine people wear those. So this signifies to trans players that, hey, this is you, or maybe this is a character you want to play as. And they really get it and pick up on it. So you see that even games with a set gender really benefit from asking themselves this question. And what's particularly great about this example is that it also reinforces the theme of masculinity and queerness in the game, so it really goes hand in hand. So to summarize this section, I have a few questions that I hope will lead you through this a little bit further. So, does gender play a role in the theme at all, like maybe through identity or queerness? Should it impact the gameplay in romance or conversation options? Is there maybe even a different gender system or species biology somewhere in your game because you're making a fantasy game or a sci-fi game and you're really going a weird place that is super interesting? And does adding gender or delving further into gender add depth to your game, or does it actually detract from it because it's not in line with what your game's about? So I'll give you a moment to take a photo if you'd like, and also take a break. All right, on to the next question, which is, how do we refer to the player? So this is very straightforward. It's just, where are they talked about? Is it NPCs? Is it in menus? Is it in narration somewhere? So one way of tackling this that I've already shown you is, of course, a pronoun selection. You offer a choice of pronouns, and I would strongly recommend having more than two if you go through the effort of doing this. And as I mentioned before in read-only memories, you also have a custom pronoun input. At this point, I do want to warn you about localization. I have a separate localization interlude in a moment, but here it's important to point out that with custom pronoun input, what that means is you type in the pronouns of the different grammatical cases. I haven't seen that localized yet. Might be interesting, though. And of course, with the choice of pronouns, those also might translate differently to a different game. So in English, if you were to present a set of 5 different pronouns and you translate it into Finnish, you're going to just end up with one pronoun. So you might not want to have a pronoun selection screen in Finnish. Overall, you see this option a lot for text-heavy games, because it's a matter of swapping out a string and then multiplying the choice that way. A different way of doing something kind of similar that I feel doesn't get as much attention but is also super interesting is going about it with titles and names. Because pronouns aren't always the best choice when the player isn't talked about much, but a direct address also holds a lot of choice. So it might not make a lot of sense if characters always approach players directly to let them choose a third-person pronoun, because it never gets used. But in this example of Sunless Seas, you get to choose a title. And the options are Madam, Sir, Citizen, My Lord, My Lady, and I believe there's 2 more if you keep scrolling. And what this does is that it enhances the tone and really adds to the world building of this game. And something super interesting that it additionally does is that it combines gender with a different form of role play. Because if, for example, you look at the citizen option, it actually describes it as a term of address popular among those of egalitarian sentiments. So it says something about your gender, which is not much at all, and a lot more about your class consciousness and class allegiance. So that's really cool and very thoughtfully designed and written. Of course, I've already mentioned using the direct address to also avoid gender entirely. So you go the opposite way. You have a direct form of address, but you consciously only stick to addressing players directly as you. Of course, this means, though, that you also need to pay attention of not accidentally putting something in that feels nice in speech, like ma'am, or hey, my guy, or yes, sir. So in Anno, we consciously went through our script and checked if we had accidentally slipped something in there and then cut it out. Because if the gender is irrelevant, you have decided that it's irrelevant to your game and you don't really want to bring that in there, then why introduce gendered language in the first place? At this point, I also want to point out that this might translate differently, that in English, you is very gender neutral, but not necessarily in every other language. Which brings us to our localization interlude. So I unfortunately don't have all the answers for all the different languages that are out there, but I do have a few pointers that I hope will make it a little bit easier for you. The first one is planning as early as possible. Which languages you are translating into, if there are any tech considerations. Like I mentioned that if you have 5 pronouns in English but only 1 in Finnish, then in the Finnish version you might not want to have the pronoun selection screen at all. So that's something to keep in mind. And also on your production timeline, when are you starting this? I, of course, recommend that the planning should start as soon as possible. Which means getting in touch with your translators as soon as possible, because they're waiting for you to approach them about this. This is a big and very current topic in the localization community that I know a lot of teams are actively working on. There are already games that have been released that have interesting approaches to this. So it really is something that is being worked on and that people can help you with. And you're going to have to do all of this anyway, even if you stick to binary genders. So if you think that, oh, this seems like a lot of work, so I'm just going to stick with male and female, you're going to have these considerations anyway, because if you're going to have to swap out for 2 different strings, you're going to do that anyway. So just do it all in one go. There's no excuse. And something that's going to help is being specific about your needs. Because there is a difference if, for example, you say, oh, I want the opportunity for players to play as a genderqueer character. That might translate differently, use different language than if you go with very gender neutrality in the sense of, oh, this includes all genders and is very non-specific and vague. That might translate differently. So providing as much context as possible to your localization manager is great. And also, be prepared to do some research and work with queer organizations from the countries of the languages that you are translating into. Because not every language or culture has an established neutral pronoun the way that the English mainstream is starting to sort of have, or is even moving in that direction. So it might be that you can't easily find out what the established pronoun is, because there isn't one, and you're going to have to find the solution. All right, to summarize this section, how do we refer to the player? So first thing to ask yourself is, who or what talks to or about the player? Is it NPCs, the narrator, menu text? Do you want to offer a choice, or do you want to keep it neutral? And can you use this to enhance roleplay? And if you do, then what type of language fits your game best? And have you consulted with a localization manager yet? So to move on to the next question, which is, what's the basis of your player avatar? because all of your best intentions, like offering a lot of pronouns and unlocking all of these customization options and mixing and matching things, are going to be pretty moot if at the end you present players with a selection of two idealized body, like an idealized woman and an idealized man. So what are some other ways of doing this without breaking the budget? So the first suggestion I have for you is working from a single body template and making one body, because this is quicker than making a female and a male one. And what you then can do is you can work with blend shapes to radically change this body and give players a lot of freedom in what the end result is going to look like. So, for example, in Calico, they started with a single model, and then you can change on these sliders the waist and the chest and the bottom and the shoulders and the facial features. So you do end up with very differently looking characters, and characters that do look very feminine or do look very masculine or do have a combination of these things. If you want more information on this, then I highly recommend Aubrey Scott's GDC talk, Genderfuck 2077, because she gives some fantastic tech insights into blend shapes and how she's used them in their own work. It's free on the GDC Vault. And this is also a really great way of introducing more body diversity, even aside from looking at it from the gender lens. Another way might be having archetypes. So this is from Saints Row 5, and these are the archetypes that you get to choose from and then further customize. So this allows for greater diversity because you get to sculpt them all individually. And if you feel like just using blend shapes on a single body isn't getting you the technical fidelity and the visual fidelity that you want, this is a great way of doing it. Because you can afterwards also still combine this with blend shapes to then push the bodies even further to make them look even more different. And what's cool about this is that working with archetypes is also something that works for 2D and 3D. So, for example, Picrews are really popular for making little avatars online. And they just show a bust of a character of who's going to be you or a character that you're making. And you often find the option to change the shoulder shape or size. So those are also archetypes. A really cool and different way of doing this is having no template at all. And this one's a little bit more tricky and requires a little bit more ground-up thinking, but I really love this example. Because in Sunless Skies, for this cameo creator, you can mix and match these individual features to create a unique avatar. And there's no artificial gendering, because there's not going to be a female face and a male face if there are no female chins and male chins and female noses and male noses. It's just chins and noses and brows and hairstyles and hats and outfits. And then you just put these together. And so I've created these two, and they have the same facial features. They just have a different hairstyle and a different clothing option. And you can already tell that this changes what this character is perceived as or the vibe entirely. So this works so well because the team is kind of known for having really thoughtful and experimental design to really approach this from a different angle. So it's very cool. So to summarize this section, things to ask yourself to pick this apart a little bit is, how should players see their character in the game? Are there any genre conventions at play? Like, are you making a visual novel, so you are having these style of portraits? Or do you want a third-person model? Can you break the binary here to give players more choice? And how can you do this cost-effectively without falling back on idealized bodies? I'll give you a moment to take a photo if you'd like. So for the next question, which is, how can players accurately represent themselves? So what I mean by this is, how can we get all of those little in-between steps? I've touched on this in the previous section already a little bit, which is the idea of using sliders to get all of those little granular steps in between. Because that way you can multiply the choice with every little step, and because it's not this binary on or off, it's like a nose can look like this or like this, and also anything in between. You can do this for body types and body parts, as I've just touched on. But you can also use this for other things, like, for example, a voice pitch. So in the two examples, in the upper one, which is Saints Row 5, those are for the body. But in the lower example, it's strafe, and that is actually a voice pitch slider. It could be labeled a little better, but I don't want to give the makers of strafe any shit, because this game, I think it's a little older, and at the time, this was a really cool way of approaching it and giving players a new idea. It's like, hey, this isn't just like you pick the male or the female one and you get the high-pitched voice or the low-pitched voice. It's like, no, what if this actually was a spectrum? How about we actually do represent this as more of a spectrum than a binary option? And I'm wondering what else could be possible here. Like, what else can we put on a slider to really represent that there is more than just two things? So another way of getting that accuracy is, of course, having a ton of options. And for some games, that's going to be the right choice. So Sims is really cool because they also went with Sims 4 and retroactively unpicked their gameplay to stop assuming things about bodies. So the screenshot on the left is from a DLC that already came out a fair few years ago. And what they did is they went in and were like, OK, so previously they had like you could choose a male sim or a female sim, but now they're taking all of these gameplay implications and putting the control over to the player, because that's what this game is about. So you can choose the physical frame, and then independently from that, you can choose the clothing preference. Independently from that, you can choose whether your sim will be able to become pregnant or get others pregnant or neither. And also independently from that is whether this sim uses the toilet standing or sitting. So that's really worth looking into. And then, of course, there's also fashion and accessories, because through clothes and scarves and accessories, everyone expresses themselves through fashion. And it's particularly cool because it can also be trans-specific. So actually, just earlier this year, there was another Sims DLC. And among the things that it added were these options. So the first one is top surgery scars from a breast reduction. The second one is shapewear that trans feminine people might be wearing. And the third one is, again, the binder that I mentioned from Dream Daddy. So this is really cool, because Sims has so many things that, of course, why not have this, because some people wear that. And that's also a great point to think about beyond gender. Again, thinking about more options for body size, having enough options for skin tones, and also thinking about disability, because in the same update from these wearables, they also have medical wearables and like hearing aids, for example. And that was also really well received. So to summarize this section, what assumptions are we currently making that we can instead turn over to players to choose from? And how can we make players' choices more granular? And how can we offer all of those little bits in between? And can we multiply these choices without actually multiplying the workload? So to move on to our final point, how can players express themselves in play? This is the fun one. So I want to share two cool examples with you. Because what if we do let players make statements about their identity? In Queen at Arms, which is the picture on the left, it's a visual novel. And this one you might not really think of very much when it comes to character customization, because the protagonist is a set character. And of course, being a visual novel, you still get to choose at different points in the story between different story options. And the premise of the game is that the main character, who was assigned female at birth, is raised as a boy because they're expected to lead an army eventually, and you can do that better by being assumed a man. So at one point in the story, you get to choose how your main character actually feels about this. And you can say, yeah, I am a woman. I was just always disguised as a boy, and I had to do this in order to get this credibility, but I want to go forth and live my life as a woman. Or you can say, yeah, this was complete coincidence that they raised me as a boy, but actually this was great, and I really enjoyed it, and I want to keep doing it because I am actually a guy. And that's something that is very unique to the premise of this game, and I wonder, like, what other unique premises are out there where you could do something similar? What's also really cool is thinking about how you can create meaningful interactions with NPCs and your themes. So in Dragon Age Inquisition, you have Krem, and at the time when this game came out, he was basically like one of the first really well done representations of a trans man, and you could go up to him and chat to him about it, and he'd give you a little bit of insight, and it was really cool, very well received. But it's still assumed that the players that will approach him will be cisgender, meaning they're not trans, so they're going to be like, oh, wow, so what's that, and how does that work? And it was really well written. But how cool would it be to go up to Krem, and he tells you a little bit about himself, and you go, hey, buddy, me too, which really changes the interaction. And all of this is a really rare chance to actually explore what gender is. Because at the beginning of the presentation I said, it doesn't matter, forget about it. But if you don't want to forget about it, and you are very interested, and you do want to explore this, then these are some really cool ways of doing it. And I very much encourage you to do it if you want to. So something that might get overlooked a little bit, but is also an avenue, is thinking about having fun with custom nicknames. So this is not as much about gender, but it can be used as an avenue to play around. So in Animal Crossing, in New Horizons, they don't really want to bring in gender at all. And characters will sometimes come up to you and be like, hey, we're such good friends, and I want to have a custom nickname for you that's just for us, or a greeting that's just between us. And then you get to type something in. So you totally can also use that, like, hey, girl, things like that. And a really different approach, or a different element, might also be having something in multiplayer. So thinking about communicating with other players and using symbols to do that. So this is from Gears of War Online, and they have a variety of banners. They also have a Sea of Thieves crossover promotion. But they also have Pride banners, so they have a large selection, is what I'm getting at. And you can pick one of the Pride banners if you feel that represents you well, and then flag that to other people, quite literally. And this is a rare chance to also reinforce community and making statements of pride. So that's very neat. So to summarize the section, think about how players can state their gender identity, and how they can maybe communicate this to other players as well. And can you add something that will help them create a sense of community? And can your players interact meaningfully with queer characters or themes if those are present in your game? And what could be a fun way to express gender? So, in conclusion, after having led through this, I want to put them all together on the screen again. So the 5 steps are from like high level to lower level, more specific. What role does the player gender have in your game? And how do you refer to the player? What's the basis of the player avatar? And how can players accurately represent themselves? And how can players express themselves in play? So to leave you with a little bit of further reading that I highly recommend, again, Aubrey Scott's GDC talk, Genderfuck 2077, because she goes into a lot of fundamentals of how to approach this on a very practical level. She has a lot of great 3D tech solutions. She also talks about how she has used this in her own projects quite specifically. And she also has some really great insights on genitals, because thanks to Cyberpunk 2077 and now also Baldur's Gate, that is also something we're doing now, which is cool. And secondly, also a GDC talk that is also free on the GDC Vault is Benjamin Williams' Respectful Non-Binary Representation Localization, which is a really fantastic broad work on best practices. He has more insights on localization and getting some of those tricky things and having some shortcuts. And he also talks a little bit about authored characters. And then resources where you can find examples and survey data and essays is the Queerly Represent Me charity, as well as the LGBTQ Gaming Archive. The archive in specific has a lot of examples from different games, like queer characters appearing somewhere. And of course, I love to chat about this topic, so you can find me on Blue Sky, and you can find me on Twitter, while that's still around, at Arden Osthof. You know, you never know. So thank you very much for listening.
Yes, Arden, a really good presentation. I was just wondering, like, because you gave so many different examples, what is your favorite game for character customization?
Oh no, don't do this to me.
Yes, of course.
I haven't played Saints Row, but it is my favorite in terms of character customization, especially the third one and the new one, because what's so cool about it is, especially in the fifth one, they're really not gendering your character at all, but they give you still very they still give you the option to look very hyper feminine or hyper masculine, and also in between, and also they have a lot of body diversity. So that's really important part of that. So that's probably my favorite.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, are there some questions from the audience? Not every. Oh yes, Mr.
Yeah, I think so. It's recorded, I think.
What is the state of multiplayer games in this regard? I
Multiplayer
mean,
games.
toxic players out there, as soon as the game offers much diversity, there are many players in the multiplayer voice chat and so on. Are there things beside moderation or that can be used there? Because Dragon Age Inquisition and so on, it's all single-player games, so... What about that?
That's true. That is really tricky. I'm not really an expert on how to ensure that there's not that much toxicity in multiplayer games. Something that I could think of is if we're talking about giving players lots of choices to customize their character, or having these cool pride banners, or maybe people will want to start putting their pronouns in their bio or next to their avatar, is to also think about who they would like this to be visible towards. Like only visible to friends, visible to my team, visible to everyone. That's just me spitballing, but I think that's very key because I think personally, from my experience, it's like sometimes I do want everyone to know I'm trans. Like with this room, I feel quite comfortable sharing, but I don't feel comfortable where I really don't know where I am and what kind of crowd it is. So just thinking it from that perspective of like when you introduce these choices, to also be transparent about who's going to see them, and maybe then even giving the possibility to making them less visible for safety. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any good resources for finding neo-pronouns in different languages?
Yes, there is a wiki that I have forgotten the name of. There is a wiki. I'm gonna try and find it, and then we can chat afterwards. But I think if you Google around for, I think it is actually a neo-pronoun wiki. But I would caution you because it has a long list, so it's great to be like, okay, so there are a lot of things, but it doesn't really distinguish between which ones of these are actually in use, which ones will be recognized, that kind of thing. So it kind of goes back to needing to work with people who have knowledge on this. So there's always the fallback of developers asking around with their genderqueer friends that speak another language or are from another country, getting in touch with organizations, because these things also change super fast. And also in Germany, I've noticed that I lived abroad for 3 years and then I came back to Germany, and in that time, the favored pronoun changed. And also depending on what group I'm in, sometimes you see more of one pronoun and more of another pronoun. So yeah. It's unfortunately not that easy to find a good list.
Any other question? Yes.
Hi. I'm wondering about animation, actually, because that's a problem that we encountered. A big problem, actually, which made us revert to the idealized body types. Because if you need a character to sit down on a chair or pick something up, the size and shape of a body can lead to clipping problems or alignment problems. And for us, for budget reasons and performance issues, we had to revert to the perfect.
Right. But then you still have two, though.
We do, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to gently push back. So I totally
Yeah.
get it, and I really understand that production constraints in the moment are super real. But if you're thinking about that, you're already going through the trouble of doing this for two separate characters. Is thinking about, is there a way to maybe make this work for, like a single body template and then having very slight variations where it's like an acceptable bounds? I have also, which doesn't really help with the clipping, but I did one time hear the idea of also letting players choose, if there are several different types of animations, letting them choose what type of animations the characters might be using. So that's going the opposite way. That's going in the more budget way, but still.
Yeah, we can only have one. That was the issue. Like.
Right.
But yeah, thank you.
Any other question?
What are some of people's? Oh, there is one more question.
There's one more? Okay.
To left.
More questions from me.
Yeah.
I've been told that some trans people separate their pronouns from their gendered terms, and has there been any example of a game doing that?
Yes, you do see this. I'm blanking right now, but I would say it is a generally really good idea to, when you're offering pronoun choice, for that to be an independent choice from everything else, so that you pick the pronoun and then you pick the appearance, or if there is like ever a statement about who they are, to have that be separate, because that is a really good idea. I have seen it where it's not been the case, and that's annoyed me. So in Baldur's Gate, not to shit on everyone's darling, but in Baldur's Gate, you get to pick an identity term, and what the game doesn't tell you is that changes your pronoun. And it's like, no, if it changes your pronoun, it should say that on the label, and then it ideally should only change your pronoun. Oh, there's someone right behind you who's... Oh, yeah.
I know a game with an option like that. Shovel Knight has an option that has like different bodies and then different pronouns. So
yeah, that's awesome.
That's one game that did this.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you.
Any other people that want to add something or question something? I think we have no questions in this room.
All right,
so you
awesome.
answered them all.
Fantastic. I hope everyone's happy. All right. Thank you all so much for coming and listening. This has been really great. Thank you.
And thank you.